So, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you have had some food. If not, now it's going to take some time to the next opportunity to feed yourself. But so thank you for coming. This is for us a very special moment as organizers of the World Music Days, because this little session, in fact, gave name to the World Festival. This is something that we are very concerned about. Why we choose this title, all of you know probably. And I would like to thank very much all the participating speakers and musicians and composers, and especially Pedro Prista, Portuguese anthropologist, that is the keynote speaker this afternoon. And because in fact he really pushes us to go in this direction, and he makes, let's say, the framing of this afternoon. So I'm really grateful to him about guiding us through this maze. Very quickly, I would like to remind you, for those that were in Porto, that we'll have soon Hugo Vasco Reis here on the Portuguese table guitar. And he's a very good composer, very prolific, producing a lot, but even playing fado, as you have seen. So it's the same person. So just sometimes, when the context change, we cannot recognize people. But no, I can tell you, it's true. It's the same person. Okay? So that was just a fun introduction to Hugo performance. And of course, this performance is somehow related with this theme, as well as the privilege we'll have to later to have about listening to the violin solo piece by Aske Zidore, which is among us, which I would like to thank very much for coming. So, and just to finish, I would like to tell you how deeply touched we are by the fact that most of the composers of these World Music Days came to Portugal to attend their performance, and that is amazing. We were not prepared for that, and that is really moving. Thank you, all of you, so much for coming, because you are the reason for this. Thank you. Have a nice concert for now.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Miguel, and thank you, Paula, for inviting me to this talk. This is something that we started discussing some years ago. The title of this talk, Thirst for Change, has a lot to do with our present condition, our present affliction in the Anthropocene situation we are living, all of us. I have a few things to tell you, and then we'll have Barry and Ville here, and then Miguel for their presentations too, and then perhaps some time for discussion, public discussion, free discussion on these issues. The first idea I want to tell you about is this idea of nowadays affliction. It's something different from eco-anxiety and different from any kind of anxiety. Affliction, it's more than an anxiety. We are aware of many different things that are happening around us, and we are noticing that those things have some links between them, and all of them go in the same dramatic horizon, the same direction. So what is that affliction we are feeling, and there is it is looming upon art creation and upon all of our lives? Well, this affliction is mostly the outcome of two things. One is war, and another one is Anthropocene. And war and Anthropocene are basically one and the same thing. Why war? We are always somehow surprised to see new wars all the time. Perhaps they are not new, perhaps we are witnessing the same old war all the times. But war is something that we all know that has no winners, only victims and ruins. That's all about war. And it's really intriguing that we are now again in the middle of global war, and 100 years ago, when the International Society for Contemporary Music was founded, we were about to leave one of the first world wars. It was not exactly the first one, but anyway, its historical name, World War I. So perhaps we are still living the same war. That means that we don't understood what we do, what we are doing in the world and with each other. That means that a huge change is in front of us, and perhaps something that artistic creation really has to lead. So war, the same old war, is here again. And I wonder what happened to all the other wars, so that we haven't seen really the end of times. why are we still here after so many wars, after the same old war all the time? Well, perhaps art is the answer. Perhaps we are still here because we still think and we still create. Perhaps that's the main message I would like to stress in the end of my presentation. But this continuing war leads us to very deep and very disturbing issues. One of them is the presence of the war inside the creative process of art. I wonder if war and all its cruelty and violence is not perhaps the last thing that we get and we keep from childhood. Well, war is anyway condemning all of us to some circular destiny, and that war is not only the war, the military war, it's also the violence internalized in social tensions everywhere. So perhaps that this situation of permanent war we are living and global war goes deeper inside ourselves, and perhaps it goes in a wider perspective to many other points and many other levels of global existences and human presence on Earth. Perhaps something about domination, perhaps about empire, perhaps about extraction, perhaps about spontaneous violence is on this war and keeping this war around all the time. Well, but anyway, the dramatic situation now, it's really a military fight everywhere. And this military fight is doubled nowadays with another war. It's not a metaphor. It's also an act of violence, and it's organized. And that fight is a fight not among humans, it's a fight of humans against nature and against the earth. And this fight, this double war, is now, in the global situation we are living, it's now really something new, or at least recent, in our memories and in our experience of life in this world. So what it leads to, well, this double war, it's taking us to a kind of scatological triumph. We face now the possibility of, for the first time, really, an end of times, and an end, perhaps, of everything, if we don't cultivate and if we don't care for our creative possibilities and our creative moves and our creative impulses. So this is really a new situation, and this new situation where different wars are mixed and are fought at the same time, this new situation really deserves the name of Anthropocene. Well, what is Anthropocene? Well, Anthropocene has been different things in the last 20 years, more or less. The first meaning of this Anthropocene it's a very technical or basically scientific one. That means that for the first time, humans have the power of interference in the Earth system in its whole. So it started being a geological name proposed by Paul Crutzen in the early 2000, in the year 2000, in a meeting, and it was supposed to correspond to a moment in human history when where the possibility of changing so deep some dynamics and processes in the world system, that everything was out of our control. Everything could become totally out of our control. Well, it really did happen, but officially not. That means that the International Geological Commission, that decides the names of these epochs, geological epochs, found that there was not perhaps enough evidence that geological strata were being already transformed by human action on Earth. But the decision is not definitive. And besides the geological perspective on the Anthropocene, there are other perspectives. And perhaps one of the most interesting ones is not the geological, but the anthropological one. That means the Anthropocene can be not so much, or at least by now, a geological epoch, but it can be an anthropological epoch. It's a moment when we get a systemic awareness of the fact that we can, and perhaps we are, finishing times and destroying the possibility of continuing being creative. Well, the Anthropocene, it's not only that perspective, that broad perspective on Earth systems. More or less by the same time, the idea of Anthropocene was proposed by, and the name of Anthropocene was proposed by Paul Crutzen and others. Another concept started circulating in the scientific meetings and discussions, and that other concept is the concept of a great acceleration. A great acceleration means that scientists were not only interested on assessing what was happening in the Earth system, but they were also interested on understanding how it became to be, how it was made. What happened in our history, in the world, for that to happen. And great acceleration means that not everybody in the world was responsible in an equal way for Anthropocene, that not all were in the same position, and the outcomes were not being imposed equally to all. That means the history of Anthropocene was saying that lots of things that we call, or that we put inside the concept of Anthropocene, in fact have a specific origin and have a specific place and they are a specific product of a specific society and culture. Well, we can never talk about specific societies and cultures because all of them are layered and have a lot of contradictions inside. But anyway, there is clearly something about hegemonic West, about this that we call Anthropocene. And the great acceleration was meaning that things have started, nobody knows exactly when. For some scientists, it started perhaps in the Neolithic. For others, it started after the Middle Ages with modern science and modern sea expansion, seafarers and the so-called discoveries around the world. But mainly, everybody agrees that the Industrial Revolution by mid-18th century is a safe moment because lots of things changed on that moment. Energy, trade, technology, economy, structure of societies, power everywhere. So this is a moment that more or less everyone agrees that really started another change, perhaps with other changes before, but another change, a decisive another change. But the Great Acceleration, it's not exactly that change. The Great Acceleration is precisely the one after 1945, so after another war, the same old war, the Second World War. That's the moment of the Great Acceleration. And for that Great Acceleration, scientists now have a way of measuring and taking pulse of the dynamics of that process. We now have a set of tipping points that we know that if they are surpassed, they will lead to outcomes that are totally out of our reach of control and of our possibility of management. So the Great Acceleration, it's a kind of way of thinking about the Anthropocene in a much more localized and historically clear moment and situation. But it's not only Great Acceleration and its tipping points. It's also another thing besides this one. And that other thing, it's something called critical zone. That means that now, for a large part of biodiversity, and specifically for human beings, there is a very slim layer in the Earth system where most of the biological and geological exchanges occur. And that slim situation is exactly the one where we live, of course, and that's the one we are more deeply destroying every day. We can think about cosmic space and time that is totally out of our control. But this slim layer of the critical zone is something that we can manage, and that's exactly the one we are mostly destroying. Well, what happens on that slim critical zone, and how are we to be responsible for what's happening there? Well, really too many things are happening in the critical zone, of course, but we know that on that critical zone, a kind of existence named human existence, that means us, have the possibility of thinking and have the power of making changes. And also feeling that anxiety, feeling the affliction that moves us to a change. An historian, an Indian historian that teaches in Chicago, Dipesh Chakrabarty, wrote a marvelous essay about the changes of scale of this setting where we are thinking and feeling the affliction of Anthropocene. And he wrote that we are now living in different times, so different histories at the same time. We live and we are aware of a huge history, which is the history of the planet. That means the cosmic time of a planet, a geological reality, a cosmic reality called the planet. But we are also living in a place, in a specific place of our existence we call the Earth. And that existence we take in a relational way with other humans and with other existing things and living beings, and that means a world, the kind of sphere we live in, the interactive sphere we are living permanently. Just as sound sphere, that's the realm of something that we receive from the Earth, but from our neighboring world. That means the place we are interacting with others. Well, and then we have another thing. Then we have the global. The global sometimes is used as the planet, but for Chakrabarty, it's not exactly the planet. The global is what happened after our imperial economy took over everything that was happening in the world. So these are four concepts that for Chakrabarty can be used to understand and to think about what is happening in the Anthropocene. Planet, world, Earth, and global. When we think about Earth, we think that perhaps our relation to the Earth and our relations to the others in this Earth, that relation is perhaps losing touch with the planet. And that loss of touch will mean the loss of our, well, the expression is from Bruno Latour, it's the loss of our soul. This is the title of one of the last books by Bruno Latour, is if we lose the earth, we lose the soul. That means we lose the possibility of being creative, the possibility of bringing some change to this stressed situation we are living in. So most of that interaction on Earth, on our world, occurs in that slim layer of the critical zone. And on that slim layer of the critical zone, we find lots of different things, but perhaps one in particular that is incredibly challenging. And not only challenging, it's very telling, because there are lots of puzzling questions and issues that the interaction with that thing brings to our mind. And that thing that happens a lot in that critical zone, that occurs a lot and has a very specific characteristics, is water. Water, it's not, of course, the most important thing in the critical zone, because the critical zone has no most important thing. Everything is important. But water is a kind of a line that helps us to to think about many different things and teaches us very disturbing lessons. Water, it's not only, I'd say, devilish molecule. It has an incredible chemical structure and electric behavior and changes of states, and it bends with lots of things. And well, water, it's not only considered essential to life, but water runs through all the critical zone. That means water is a kind of general link that can take us by hand and let us understand, think, discuss, be amazed by what's happening in that interactive structure we call critical zone. So water is perhaps a very good molecule and reality to think about the Anthropocene. And not exactly on the perspective that water is so essential, is so omnipresent in the on Earth, on the critical zone, but also because we know very well what it means to miss water. That means water has a very interesting, among many others, very interesting quality. Water we can miss water for too much water and not enough water. That means water can destroy us if water is not available to us, or if water is too much for us. There is perhaps a reason why deluge is considered a very universal myth on the imagination of water. And not only flooding, but also drought can become a very emotional experience of our relation with all the other existences in the critical zone. So this was exactly what was happening some time ago, nearly less than 1 year ago, when we were living here in Portugal, one of the most dramatic droughts for many, many years. And Miguel, Paula, and I were looking at a huge dam in a very dry place in the south of Portugal, where water was really disappearing, and instead of water, we were witnessing social struggles and social violence and social conflicts around it. And in the middle of this war, this was a war, in the middle of this war, we were noticing another thing. We were noticing that there were still many persons there that knew very well what water was, much better than some scientists or technicians supposedly knew. They knew by a very deep understanding and very deep practice of a relation with water. They knew very well what water used to be, what water was before that huge dam, and what kind of relation with water we should not lose in order to keep being alive and creative in a drought situation. So that very deep, not only traditional, but deep culture of water was some kind of a huge lesson to society experiencing violence in the moment of very dramatic drought in that place. I was leading on that moment a research program there was named Twin Waters. It was about the destiny of a river, the river that was blocked by a dam, and there were two different waters arriving from that river. The one that was being conducted to industrial agriculture far away, and another one that was flowing in a creek, in a small creek that before was the river near. So we were thinking a lot about what the Anthropocene brings to our mind and to our thoughts when we look at what happens to a river when a powerful human intervention makes a huge dam in the middle of that river, and when very dramatic drought brings everything to an extreme condition. That means bring all of us in that place to affliction. So reflecting on that affliction, we were also reflecting about the creative possibility of regeneration and about the power of resurgence in that dry landscape we had in front of our eyes. Regeneration, it's a wonderful concept by Anna Tsing. It's different from renewal. There is a part of invention in resurgence, in the sense that Anna Tsing gives to the world. That means something creative is happening in nature, and the weird forms of existence are growing from that situation Anna Tsing calls patchy Anthropocene. That means the messy landscape of destroyed things and new things growing and being generated from that messy situation. Well, I thought that perhaps this idea by Anna Tsing and the situation we had in front of us could be inspiring for reflecting on the place of art creation in the Anthropocene. And 3 or 4 main ideas came to my mind. The first one, it's a melancholic reflection we have facing the condition of Anthropocene. I remember reading a sentence by Claude Lévi-Strauss by the end of his book Triste Tropique, when he says that the world started without humans and it will end without humans. Well, this is the reason why he proposed some lines beyond this one to call anthropology anthropology, the science of something that is in decay. But there is also another perspective. There is the perspective that something can be grown in the middle of the rubbish of this decay, and this is what may be called an ontogenesis of humanity and of life. How can we make it? Where from will we make it? Well, maybe the only answer is creation. And perhaps the only creation is artistic creation. How to make it? Mainly by attending, listening, relating to everything around us. This is also an interesting lesson that water gives us. And this is perhaps one of the meanings of the role of art creation in the Anthropocene. Another one is responsibility. That means we are all here, and we are not the only existence, and we are not entitled to use the whole world for the purposes of our consumption addiction. That means something has to take into account other societies, other peoples, other cultures, other existences, other living, other non-living things around us. And now to finish, the last thing that that is a quote from Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt wrote that the source, the immediate source of art, it's the human ability for thinking. Immediate. She's not saying that the source of art is human thought. She says that the immediate source of art creation is our ability to think. Well, our ability to think is nowadays under the threat not only of artificial intelligence, but also under the threat of other things, as the high-tech social engineering of opinions and of alienations. So perhaps it's one of the most important things that we may expect for art creatives, from art creation, is to help us keep our human thinking alive, creative, curious, moving beyond, and producing new things, attentive to other things around. That's it. Thank you very much. Barry and Ville, please, to join us here. Miguel, já é que
Podes ligar o computador? Não, vai em cima do desligado.
E você daqui para trás. Exatamente, é isso mesmo.
Well, it always has we always have a mind of their own. Yeah. Oh, I removed this part of the protocol. Just set it up there. Yeah. Okay, I think we're ready. I'm Barry Truax, Professor Emeritus from Simon Fraser University, and it's an incredible pleasure to be back here again in this wonderful occulto environment, and thanks to Miguel for the invitation. I'm also particularly pleased that he found a way of somehow integrating extra musical, you have to be careful how you say that, extra musical considerations into an otherwise contemporary music festival that to me is encouraging to have this kind of openness to a broader range of ideas. But they also, of course, reflect how artistic creation, which has been so eloquently handled by Pedro there, is actually starting to explore these these new avenues and new relationships to the world. I think many of you know that I was invited by Murray Schafer back in 1973 to join him in this fledgling World Soundscape project. And the database index that I just showed you is what I've created and curated to house everything associated with the Soundscape project and all of the legacy that has continued right up till the current time. So this is the iconic classic picture of Schafer on the left and his field recording team that he assembled. I'm the one at the back there because I was the new kid. And the history behind this, what led up to this 1973 photograph, is that he was a charter member of SFU, a brand new university that was going to be experimental and multidisciplinary and McLuhan-esque and all that. He came in 1965 as a founding member. And when he came to Vancouver, he was totally offended and bothered by the noise of the city. And he thought that the 1960s had produced technological change in the Anthropocene, I suppose, that was being radically altering the soundscape. And as someone who had already been challenging music education pedagogy, which it was, like many places, was still very conservative in Canada and elsewhere, he started talking about noise and wrote the Book of Noise and the New Soundscape. And he started by creating a course in noise pollution because this was open. So this was significant because here was a composer who was not only challenging pedagogical norms in music, but was also starting to step outside the composer role to address social issues. It sadly, in a way, but almost predictably, the noise pollution course didn't really motivate people. It was like almost all anti-noise efforts historically. It was kind of doomed to a kind of pessimistic failure, combination of what can you do about it and so on. It had this negative aspect to it. So Schafer made the critical decision and conceptual change that reversed the whole thing to a listener-centered approach to what was positive about the soundscape, or at least a listening stance that would pay more attention to sound and evaluate a broader range and not just being against something. Also, it's the same thing in health. Health is not just the absence of disease. You need a positive kind of model. And that, in fact, has, to this day, empowered people everywhere. And this, I certainly wouldn't be here at this point, 50 years later, if it hadn't been for that approach that he changed. So he had to challenge various canons or norms. One was, of course, the obvious one of expanding music to sound. It sounds, fairly obvious to us now, and of course we think of John Cage doing something very similar, but for rather different reasons and in a different kind of context. But it meant that you're going to be dealing with all sound. And this, of course, posed the problem. He pointed out the problem is that in the music classroom, with all of this attention to producing beautiful sound and finely sophisticated and nuanced sound, the rest of the time outside the classroom and outside the concert hall, there was acoustic chaos and people were shutting their ears and not paying attention. In fact, they were deadening their listening abilities. So he realized that the first powerful thing to do was to emphasize listening, to listen to everything, and then start critiquing what was positive and what was important socially and psychologically and culturally. And the second thing was, because this is the field recording team, there were lots of other people working on the project in the studio and in the library and so on and so forth. But this was the intrepid team that went across Vancouver to start with, and then British Columbia, and then two of them went across Canada, and then this group, not me, went across Europe as well during that first 5-year period. I joined them just as they were finishing the Vancouver soundscape documentation of it. So recording, even though Schaefer was notoriously, supposedly anti-technology, he had a way of technology and emphasizing all of the bad things, and he didn't pull any punches about how he felt about technology. But he founded the electronic music studio at SFU, and he saw that the technology itself, this kind of recording technology, wasn't bad or anything like that, but that it had a power to do two things. One is to focus listening. If you've done field recording, you know that it's not, I got it on tape, it's that it's an extension of hearing. And then the documentation of the fleeting aspect of sound that is also always disappearing, either momentarily or culturally over longer periods of time. Documentation was very important. And then the representation of recordings to listeners and the shock of the familiar, you might say, which was quite true in Vancouver. People, when you live there, you just sort of go about your business and you don't actually listen to the soundscape or its changes. And so representing via recording, in other words, the beginning sense of composition being involved in that. So the technology and the listening. The listening pretty much typified itself by the practice of sound walking. So sound walking, which has now been accepted even internationally by the ISO as it's a part of a more perceptually and qualitative orientation towards the acoustic environment, was typical and central to the idea of the primacy of listening, and also to challenge, in fact, the traditional Western idea of composer, performer, audience as a linear and hierarchical chain of communication. Because I think you could argue, I can argue, I always do, that sound walking brings together the performer, the composer, and the audience all together in one thing. It is a form of real-time composition. And in fact, you choose what to listen to, how to pace it, and how to move a path that goes towards greater dissonance or energy or the opposite, and it has a structure to it. And essentially, the Western idea of the hierarchy of the musician is also being challenged. So the more he and his team and the rest of us worked at this, the more we realized we had to reevaluate a lot of the received wisdom and the kind of traditional practices. So I'm not going to go through the history in general of what we actually did, the different productions during that period, because it's all here. But I wanted to then, in keeping with our theme today, refer to what happened. Well, first of all, I should mention that what Schaefer started here, and then of course this includes the period where he wrote the music environment as his classic book. Sorry, the music of the environment, which was the essay, and that led to his classic book, The Tuning of the World, 1977. And 20 years later, interesting enough, after this picture was taken, it was 20 years later, this whole movement that was spawned by him and his book and started propagating itself came together in 1993 in Banff with the creation of the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology. And that was the idea that acoustic ecology then was based on soundscape as a perceived environment, which was, of course, the corollary of listening. The soundscape is the perceived environment, or the perceived sonic environment, which can be studied by acoustical engineers and manipulated. But the perceived acoustic environment is the soundscape, and that acoustic ecology then is understanding it as a system. This definitely, I can verify that in the 70s, systems theory and ecology was a very embracing conceptual change from, let's say, the message system of communication, who says what to whom and what medium with what effect. That's the old linear energy and signal transfer model. But understanding it, Bateson, et cetera, we're all reading these kinds of things about systems theory, and understanding ecology as a system of interrelated parts that could not be subdivided. And so in other words, it challenged all of the received wisdom, both from the scientific aspect and the technical aspect and the music pedagogy that we had all been experienced with. Okay, so that was 1993. Now, about 10 years ago, I sensed that there were, with a new generation of sound artists, students, musicians, composers, there was an increased interest in environmental issues for the reasons that we all know today have become quite critical with climate change and so on and so forth. So I decided to write an article to kind of revisit these ideas now that a good 30 years had happened of practice. And this was for an online journal, which sadly is now defunct. But I do have the article available, and I'll show you, it's on my website, I'll show you that if you want to follow it up. But I thought the problems of musicians embracing environmental issues, whether it's activism or composition or any aspect of that, was still quite fraught with problems. Partly because the traditional training has not actually been the most useful for addressing these issues. So conceptually, I took two different approaches. One was looking at, of course, what I was doing and many of my colleagues were doing, was engaging as a composer with environmental issues, not just sound, but environmental issues as composition. So in other words, the creative aspect of whether it was for public awareness or aesthetics or whatever it was. And I'll show you a little more of how the range of that. And the second was, okay, not just simply what creative work could contribute to this, but also could musicians contribute to these real world issues, almost in spite of their training in a way. So because this was written, this article was supposed to be written for artists and composers and performers. And it's still, the problems that we had worked our way through were still there. One of it was that, particularly close to my experience, was the scientific terminology. So listening is fine, but once you start asking questions and what can you do, there is a fragmented set of disciplines, sub-disciplines, all the way from acoustics to applied issues, and of course speech and audiology and so on and so forth. And I was in fact put in charge of, as soon as I arrived, because I was the only one who had any science background, of what became the Handbook for Acoustic Ecology, dealing with the terminology. And so that continues to this day. And in particular, back at the page here, the handbook has migrated to an online version of it in 2012. And over the pandemic, I have created the teaching component of this, called the tutorial, and I now still teach this once a year. In fact, I'm teaching it right now. I'm just taking a break from it, from the course. It is the tutorial, the online teaching of it. And I'm not going to go through it, but just simply to tell you that this is a resource. And it has been incredibly popular. I've had, thank you, I've had hundreds of people taking this course, both everything from students and sound artists and researchers and old-timers in the field and just people, because they all sense that dealing with the the factual aspect of it, both in acoustics and electroacoustics. This is another one of the siloing of these into different disciplines. Often electroacoustics, that many of us obviously in electroacoustics have been trained in, but not so much on the acoustic side, and the connections between them are surprisingly absent in many cases. So having taught this in 2 different upper level undergraduate courses, I decided during the pandemic I needed a project, so I put all of these examples into a teachable format and then started actually teaching it myself. So later I'll show you how you can get the access to all of this material that's in the WSP database. Basically, it's just sending me truax@sfu.ca. I don't know if you can see that at the bottom. Just spell my name right, Truax. These 5 letters give people an awful lot of trouble. I've seen it all. Anyway, if you just send me an email within 24 hours, I'll give you guest access to this. But also the paper that I'm talking about is actually on my own website. So, and more recently, we've been recording the webinars, and I've put the audio commentary on it so that you could actually just listen to me talking about this as well as just reading the material itself. So it's very good for learning about sound in all of its kind of difficult ways. So thinking now about not just the composition, but what can musicians contribute? Well, they have to broaden it to sound, and then they have to somehow educate themselves on even some basic things like hearing loss and the effect of noise. I can ask, and I often do in this course, do musicians have a social responsibility? And I'm not one to say thou shalt about it. I'm not saying that you have to do this. I think you have to find your own level of comfort and how you would actually be able to do it in a way that's meaningful to you and appropriate to your professional and other interests. So things that would definitely fall into the musicians category at the very beginning is, strangely enough, hearing loss. Not strangely enough at all. It's just that I've yet to meet any students coming up through the system that have been told the slightest thing about the risks. They've heard the adults telling them that, oh, you're ruining your hearing with all that loud music, but they haven't actually had any proper instruction of what risks are in it. Should musicians be dealing with this? Well, there are many cases of hearing loss among musicians. I'm tempted to say that some of the levels I've heard so far this concert, I suspect that some composers also are exhibiting hearing loss as well. I know the signs. I've diagnosed several of my students and just by the way they over-equalize, right? And they're shocked that how to do that. No, but I think there's a kind of moral issue here. I'm not saying that you have to be an educator in this, but why are basic things about the negative aspects, hearing loss and the effects of noise that affect everybody, do we have a kind of social responsibility to inform ourselves and to speak up for what is otherwise often a silent situation? I mean, there are cases where teachers, band teachers in high schools, it's notorious, have often retired early because of hearing loss, because those band rooms are not acoustically well suited and the sounds are just basically too loud. I've already talked about the listening skills. So that is something that as soon as musicians start thinking more about, well, Schaefer called it ear cleaning, but sound walk, sound journal, recording, this is a very good elaboration. This is easier, I think, to guide students through and for musicians to be involved with. The composer as sound designer then has a notorious problem of the aesthetic versus the social. And I don't really mean it as versus, but it can be. And so that's what I'm going to talk about in terms of the composing, is because we tend to think of it aesthetically, but how do you integrate that with more social and environmental concerns? Should you really be a sound designer? Does the word, changing the word, does that give you liberty to be not just the aesthetically oriented composer? I also, since I taught in the School of Communication for 40 some odd years, communication students, you think I should be a composer? How about a sound designer, right? You know, and instead of and nowadays you just mentioned podcast and they're on, right? So it used to be called just audio documentaries, but I guess the delivery method has changed, and certainly the aspect of it. Also, acoustic ecology as a model for other environmental concerns. I think we have a lot to offer the environmental community, the people who are obviously interested, because unlike some things like air pollution, water pollution that are really dependent on the experts and measurement and engineering kind of things, sound involves everybody. It's so basic as an interface. It's our way of relating to the world, to each other, and to the community, etc. So the acoustic ecology model is one that's very positive, and more recently, people like Bernie Krause have been showing that the bioacoustic habitat is also a model of a functional, balanced, important habitat, a habitat that has to be preserved and is vulnerable to intrusions and things like that. So we have a model that is actually very positive, particularly when we find the acoustic community, the positive aspects that Schaefer looked for, particularly in the European study, and so on. So the idea here is, about this original article, was acoustic sustainability. Sustainability is, of course, an environmental byword, something that's often used, but the idea of an acoustic sustainability rather, is a very important concept, which I defined in the article as our ability as a culture to live within a positively functioning soundscape that has long-term viability.
Barry?
Yes. Yes, I'm just getting to that. Right, so now on the side of the composer, I've already indicated artistic practice can be integrated without compromising artistic integrity. So let me just give you two little hand waves here. Is, first of all, thinking about context is not something that Western classical music does. It prefers absolute music that is sound just for its own sake. There's a very strong element of that in acousmatic music, where we detach it from environmental references, at least classically, and yet we do share with the acousmatic the primacy of the ear and of listening. So when you are thinking about the practice, you could think of the physical level, the social level, and the psychological level as being something that now influences the composition at every stage. So that's argued in the paper. And the other aspect of it for soundscape composition is then what is the continuum of approaches. And this is two halves, the left half at the top and the right half, because it doesn't all fit onto one page here, is what I call mapping the real, which would go from sonification or the mapping of data onto sound, through to the documentary approach to that. In the concert on Saturday at Incomum, I'm doing my most phonographic piece, which is called The Bells of Salzburg, which is mapping the whole day in that bell-rich community onto the composition. And then the part that I deal with more in my own work, representing the real from phonography through to imaginary worlds, virtual worlds, imaginary worlds. But basically creating, particularly with 8-channel surround sound, as you'll hear tomorrow afternoon. Well, I'll just give a little preview of tomorrow afternoon's concert that will be here. The fairly recent piece, What the Waters Told Me, and of course we were just thinking about water with our previous speaker here, is I have a trilogy of pieces, all of which are going to be done in Saturday at Incomum. But the one tomorrow is typical. It's how it starts, and it's trying to bridge the gap, blur the gap, actually, between the sound of the natural world, in this particular piece, water, and the human world, speech and music, to fuse them together, hybridize them together, to not have the hierarchical boundaries between them, and to do it purely with auditory imagery. So that is sort of the range of what I'm working at, from the phonographic approach to either virtual worlds or imaginary worlds where we are integrated with sound with the world, because we know that we separate ourselves at our peril, literally at our peril. And there are some of the people who are contributing to this approach. So thanks for listening, and please come back tomorrow and Saturday if you can. To the WSP database, just send me an email. Good. You'll be getting a reply, I guarantee. Sorry. Yes. No.
First of all, thank you for the invitation to give a presentation. It's a really a big honor to speak here alongside Barry and Pedro. And thank you for your excellent talks. I was going to talk a little bit about forest ecology, but I went along lines of Pedro and then took two works with water ecology to talk about today. And I'm really going into what Barry talked about, this mapping the real, so to speak. We're talking a little bit also what you talked about, this things, patchy Anthropocene, and talk a little bit, touch upon Bruno Latour's work as well. So, let's move on. So, in this presentation, I'll discuss two compositions concerning the Baltic Sea, its underwater organisms, different marine environments, contaminants, and research data. Both works are made in collaboration with marine biologists. Waves Don't Wash on Dormant Waters is a composition and sound art piece that focuses on marine microplastics, contaminants, and bacterial growth on the microplastics. Ballast is a concerto for cello, chamber orchestra, and electronics that focuses on the Baltic Sea cargo ships, noise pollution, and recent data cable incidents in the Baltic Sea. So to start, we could ask what's the overall context we work in as environmental or ecological composers. A multitude of environmental approaches have been researched and produced since the launch of the World Soundscape project at Simon Fraser University in the late 1960s, with pioneering work of lasting significance produced by Barry Truax, Hildegard Westerkamp, Marie Schaefer, and others. Sound art has led the way, so to speak, in environmental and more specifically ecological practices. Score-based composition has picked up the pace in the last decades, with ever larger scale works by Liza Lim and others. But what does environmental and ecological mean in the context of composition? What do both of them involve, and what is the difference between environmental and ecological? Jonathan Kilmurray has pointed for clear definitions made in the visual arts context. He highlights curators Barbara C. Matilsky and Sam Bauer and their distinctions between environmental art and ecological art. According to Matilsky, ecological art not only presents but provides solutions to the problems facing natural and urban ecosystems by interpreting and framing the problems through a variety of media and environmental ethics. Sandbauer defines ecological art as a subcategory of environmental art, being an approach which often involves collaboration and restoration. In Matilsky's and Bauer's definitions, ecological art, as a distinction from environmental art, suggests or guides towards some form of practical intervention or restoration. Gilmore writes that ecological art fulfills a dual purpose for these curators. First, it informs audience about ecological issues, and secondly, it reframes the problems and models and points to potential, even practical environmental solutions. With two examples of my own collaborative compositions involving sound-based and score-based composition, I try to highlight my own shift from a broad environmental awareness-raising practice to a more hands-on and case-specific practice of ecology in composition. This practice of composition involves field recordings from certain cases of biological research at specific sites, their environmental data, and collaboration with the environmental scientists involved in the study. So let's move a bit forward. So in 2017, environmental researchers collected water and sediment samples from two sites in Helsinki, the Vanha Kaupunkilahti Bay and West Harbour area. By incubating 4 different types of common marine plastics in these samples, the researchers sought to investigate absorption of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, as well as the bacterial communities colonizing the different plastics. So they sort of absorbed other contaminants and bacterial colonies, these microplastics. 4 common types of marine plastic debris were used in the study. Cellulose acetate, usually found in cigarette filters, polylactic acid, typically dispersed from plastic cutlery, polyamide, commonly shed by nylon boat ropes, and polystyrene, typically used in packaging. So this particular work uses field recordings to respond to the microplastics of this bay and its underwater marine environment. Let's see where we are. Over here. Certain environments and phenomena attune us to listening. Sound studies scholar Brandon Labelle has described how auditory observations can sometimes exceed arenas of visibility, and how the unseen, the non-presented, and the not yet apparent can be brought to attention with sonic rather than by visual means. In my composition, areas of common visual experientiality are exceeded, as sonic sensing of materials is connected to the environmental research and data of the underwater site. In recent decades, the growing omnipresence of microplastics has contributed to a kind of material turn in environmental and cultural discussion and thought. For example, Dietmar Offenhuber has proposed that the gap between data visualizations and their corresponding phenomena might be bridged with autographic visualizations that concentrate on the materials presenting themselves to the senses in an experiential way. He uses a kind of examples of artists doing sort of kind of their own data set on top of the real environmental data. So even so, according to art scholar Heather Davis, our sensorial experience of the environment, including the effects and the aesthetics involved, has already been entirely reordered by the presence of plastic. Waves Don't Wash on Dormant Waters builds upon this material an experiential bridge with 2 kinds of sonification. First, autographic sonification of the object sources of plastic contaminants is produced by hand with cigarette filters, plastic cutlery, nylon boat ropes, and polystyrene packages. Recorded in a studio setting, these sounds act as sources of sonic contamination. Second, sound recordings from Vanha Kaupunkilahti Bay were made. The object sounds were granulated into microscopical particles and dispersed in small doses into the underwater sounds. A kind of microplasticity of the object recordings is achieved, a sonic contamination of the underwater recordings. A kind of incommensurability and incompatibility between the datasets and sound processes produced becomes evident since they come from 2 very different domains. A translation is needed to move from one domain to the other, a kind of translation that is perhaps similar to what Bruno Latour has described as necessary in observing networks involving human and non-human actants. The research data presented required a translation. The numerical data of the environmental measurements were transported and scaled to numerical music data. The 4 datasets became 4 musical datasets of rhythmical, registral, timbral, and spatial musical data. Let me show you. This is just very shallow water. I went with boat to get different depths of this place. And this is just playing around with, with objects. Okay. So from the first data set selected, the different molecular weights of the PAH distributed the dynamic weights of different register areas of sound. That is how shallow or deep we are in the water. So these proportions kind of take us to different depths of water. Let's just listen for a tiny bit since we don't have so much time. And this is the bass flute version of this piece. But we're going to different depths, and we will hit this clicking stone is just there, like just a tiny bit of water and the waves moving, and then we go to different depths. Is really the phrase structure what's being controlled by the data. Then, the second data set selected from the article maps PAH contamination distributions in the plastics incubated in the site samples. These were transformed into rhythmic distributions of the contaminant sounds, so the plastic objects. So it's just how these are, the individual plastic sounds are rhythmicized. So let's listen to this a little bit. And there's the bass flute trying to keep along. From the third data set, we find bacterial colonies translated to produce sonic bacterial growth, making timbral growth points in the original so-called clean water recording. You will hear water sound filtered into a kind of chord progression. So these columns over there simply become points in the register, and the water, above water sound is pushed through this set of microtonal chords, really. Let's listen to this. Last data set is a coordinate analysis of the bacterial communities, so how they were distributed with these plates of plastic. And this was translated to spatialize the sound accordingly. So we hear kind of the plastic sounds moving a little bit, dragging across across the spatial sphere. Let's listen to this. So finding agencies in non-human actants and retracing something that might first seem like a background element or place is an essential process in Brandon LaBelle's sonic agency and the actor network theory as described by Bruno Latour. By bringing forth the amplified non-human sound sources of seawater and plastic and the sonification of data from the contaminants and the bacterial communities, I wanted to bring a silent background to a sounding foreground and aim to compose affective qualities with this. Let's go to the other work. The second work I want to discuss today is Pallas, the concerto for cello, chamber orchestra and electronics that focuses on the Baltic Sea situation from both an ecological and geopolitical perspective, dealing with cargo ships disrupting marine life communication and cargo ship incidents involving data cables being cut between Baltic countries during 2022 to 2025. This composition will be premiered next year, so I don't have anything to except a lot of ideas. The work is done in collaboration with marine biologist Harri Kankaanpää, Okko Outinen and Viivi Pöyhönen from the Finnish Environmental Institute and its Department of Marine and Water Solutions. The Baltic Sea underwater sound pressure levels are monitored by the Finnish Environmental Institute during the European Union BIAS project, that's the Baltic Sea Information on the Acoustic Soundscape, at 3 standardized monitoring stations in the Finnish offshore area for approximately 6 months each year. These recordings will be used in the composition. The noise sources in the marine environment come from large ships, cargo ships, cruisers, motorboats, offshore wind farms, echolocation and underwater construction, piling to be exact. So repetitive and continuous underwater noise causes problems for marine organisms, disturbing predation and communication, and causing physiological and even gene function changes and stress. We go to smaller organisms like mussels, they are really on a cellular level affected by this. These sounds are so massive to a small organism. Ulf Bergström from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences says that the herring is a key role in the Baltic ecosystem and it's an especially important species to preserve. The herring is affected by the noise since it has really good hearing in the frequency range below 1.2 kilohertz. Some invertebrates like blue mussels, which are also a key species in the Baltic Sea, react to low frequency sound under 500 hertz, which can affect the attachment of mussels to rock, vital functions and damage the larvae. There are many goals and methods for underwater noise reduction. You can see them. Are they here on the next page? So the other side of this composition is also about communication disruption, but in the human sphere. And let's go a little bit forward. Katarina Buchholz has written last February in Statista followingly. In the last 3 months between November and January, 3 incidents of damage to Baltic Sea underwater cables have taken place, severing at least partly 7 different telecommunication links that connect Baltic states, Sweden, Finland, Germany, Estonia and Latvia. All in all, Statista has counted damage to 10 different Baltic underwater cables and 3 gas pipes, starting with the highly publicized rupture of the Nord Stream 1 and the Nord Stream 2 pipelines back in 2022. Some incidents have been attributed to accidental damage caused by ships dragging anchors across the seabed. However, The frequency and concentration of incidents have raised concerns about possible sabotage. Investigations into incidents are ongoing, and the authorities are scrutinizing vessels potentially linked to Russia's Shadow Fleet and other Russian interests. All in all, this composition draws together Baltic Sea noise pollution from cargo ships. The detrimental effects on smaller organisms is presented as modifications on musical material. How musical material itself gets disoriented, loses communication with other musical materials, and is damaged in its morphology and its functions. The human side of marine communication and connection between Baltic states is presented with small musical fragments from each country, from my composer friends. A link of musical communication and connection that ties us together. Okay, and circling back to my initial question on the difference of environmental and ecological music, do these compositions really inform audiences, reframe the problems, point to potential even practical solutions? Do they involve collaboration and restoration? Certainly, these compositions, together with their program texts, inform audiences, reframe the problems, and involve collaboration in different ways. They do not involve restoration, however, and the question of pointing to potential solutions needs to be clearly stated in the program notes and in the musical implementation as well. So I'm really just learning how to do this. There about these two pieces, maybe in the first piece, the solution is a no solution in this case. Sorry. Oh yeah, I will be done in 30 seconds. So the wood-based polymers, like the cigarette filters and this specific type of cutlery, were sort of hypothesized that they disintegrate significantly faster with the bacterial colonies in water, taking them over. But this is really not the case. So they do not disintegrate. They do disintegrate in soil, to my understanding better, but not in water. So it's a kind of no solution solution. In ballast, there's many solutions, research and information exchange, guidelines, white technology, reducing noise with education, incentives, avoidance of these areas, quiet poles and speed limits. The other sort of geopolitical solutions are not in any way my expertise and not part of ecological composing in itself, but I can point to potential infrastructural sabotage in an artistic work, as it is disrupting communication between humans in tangent somehow, to as the noise is disrupting non-human communication. Thank you for your time.
So, to finish this panel, I will try to be as brief as possible. And I will go back to the listening purpose and the belief that listening has powerful transformative meanings. The title of the presentation I propose you is Listening to the Earth, Spectral Music, A Love to Cry, which is the title of my opera that some of you have heard last Monday, and Ecological Activism. Art and music alike can be a powerful source in ecological activism because it speaks not only to the intellect, but to the emotions, the senses, and the imagination, all crucial for inspiring awareness and action, in fact, the inner terrain from which real change can begin. Music may not change carbon levels, but it can change perception. And sometimes a shift in perception is the very first step towards transformation. Among the many musical languages that speak to ecology, I would like to focus on one in particular because of my direct relation to it, spectral music. Why? Well, because my music is rooted and consequently also my new op era, as I like to call it, A Love to Cry, that many of you were able to listen. And this piece will serve me to further express my thoughts about ecological activism and the theme underlying these World New Music Days in Portugal Search for Change. Spectral music begins with sound itself, with a spectrum of overtones, the interior life of a single note. It's music born not from abstraction, but from listening deeply to the physical properties of sound. In that way, spectral music is already ecological. It tunes the ear to the material world, to resonance, vibration, decay, the very laws of nature, in fact. Think about that for a moment. In a time when the earth is overwhelmed by noise, industrial, digital, political, spectral music somehow invites us to slow down and listen. It says every sound has depth, every vibration contains complexity, and so does every living system. In my own practice, when I compose, I'm not just shaping sound. I'm learning from it. I'm listening to its microstructure, its internal shifts, its breath. This way of working reminds me that music is not just a metaphor for nature. It is nature. It moves like wind, pulses like a heartbeat, dissolves like mist. Spectral music does not shout. It does not offer slogans. What it offers is attention. And in the context of ecological crisis, attention seems to me to be a radical act. To listen closely to a tone, to a tree, to a body of water, is to say, you matter. You are not background noise, you are alive. Spectral music also teaches us to live within uncertainty and imperfection. Sounds drift out of tune, harmonics clash, nothing is static. This mirrors the fragility of ecosystems, the interdependence of everything. It's a kind of sonic humility, a reminder that we are part of a much larger vibratory web. And yet, within that fragility, there is beauty. Not the polished beauty of so-called perfection, but the raw, shimmering beauty of things as they are. That, to me, is the core of both music and ecological thinking, a sense of awe and of responsibility. And that is what art can offer ecological activism, not solutions in the technical sense, but a reorientation of perception, a resensitization to the complexity and delicacy of the systems we live within. Spectral music, with its attention to nuance, instability, resonance, is a kind of sonic ecology. It doesn't give answers, but it cultivates awareness. It makes us notice not just the loud emergencies, but the quiet losses, not just destructions, but interdependence. This is profoundly ecological thinking, in my point of view. The idea that we don't master the world, we coexist with it. That sounds, like the environment, is a living system to be entered, not conquered. So, no, music alone won't solve the climate crisis, but it can retrain our attention, reawaken our sensitivity, and help us imagine a different kind of relationship with sound, with nature, with each other. Music in general, and spectral music in particular, reminds us that there is meaning in the smallest vibrations, and that change begins when we learn to listen differently, feel deeply, and act collectively. And in this moment of ecological urgency, that might be exactly what we need. Because before we can save the planet, we have to hear it, and music teaches us how. Now turning towards quickly to my own music, which is deeply rooted in spectral thinking, as I just said, I would like to shed some light into my new op-era, A Love to Cry, as an example of spectral music and ecological activism. Microscopic and microtonal variation, timbre transformation, attention to the shaping of silence, concepts of harmonicity, etc., indeed link me with the spectral tradition, but in the case of A Love to Cry, I'm inviting you into a different mode of listening, one that is at once musical, poetic, and ecological, that is music rooted in poetry, in the sound of language, or better, the spectral formants of spoken language, in the act of listening as resistance and rising awareness to the ecological problems and policies through its own text and dramaturgy. In a time of ecological crisis, we often look to facts for answers. But I would like to remind you that facts alone do not move us. What moves us is vibration, breath, tension, the realization that our own voices are part of a much larger field of resonance. When we feel, we begin to care. And when we care, we might begin to act. Last Monday, for those that were present, you have experienced a work that is not simply music, not only opera, and certainly not just theater, but I believe a living sound organism, a poetic system, a sonic ecology. This work was commissioned by Warsaw Autumn Festival and premiered in Warsaw and then toured in Portugal and Sweden. And it was born in 2013 of urgency, ecological, emotional, existential, and yet it remains in 2025 absolutely updated and very sadly in tune with current ecological, political, and social problems, including the war barbarities again in Europe and elsewhere. The first level of the dramaturgy is based indeed upon the text that made the libretto. The libretto is made from a pass through several poems I wrote. I should better say that I have composed those texts. This pass of A Love to Cry is conceived as an initiation journey, a passage through the darkness of night towards the light of dawn, led by the dream of those who dare to dream. Crossing the night means confronting the destruction we are bringing upon ourselves, a destruction that reflects our own self-annihilation. In the face of despair and apparent death, hence, one must ask, is humanity's only possible response its own suicide? Suicide may seem like a release from the deadlock, but art stands in denial of suicide, because art is a life force. It is generative. It is regenerative. A Love to Cry is therefore not a narrative or resignation, but one of resistance. It denounces and reveals, but also imagines and proposes. It's a sonic and poetic act that demands attention, an opera that transcends conventional form to become a philosophical and emotional reflection on the very condition of being human. The work confronts destruction with the dream of transformation. It affirms that in creation lies the possibility of renewal, and in the power of art, the refusal of silence. And this brings us to the second level of the dramaturgy, a deeper level where instead of describing environmental collapses in images or slogans, I'm staging the collapse of language itself. I'm asking, what happens when the words we use to speak of crisis are no longer enough? When the voice trembles, stutters, dissolves into sound? When laughter becomes a form of despair and tears a form of resistance? The voice is not a narrator then, it is an ecosystem. It crackles, bursts, breaks apart, reformulates, it inhabits paradox. The electronics are not background, they are the weather, the distortion of our times. The performers are not characters, but a conduit through which anxiety, absurdity, and lucidity flicker like unstable light. I wanted this piece to be visceral, intimate, and deeply human. It invited us to listen differently, not just to words or sounds, but to what lies beneath them. The breath, the break, the laugh that hides the sob that hides the scream that echoes what we can no longer deny. In this way, I understand A Love to Cry as deeply ecological, not because it speaks about the environment, although it does, but because it enacts the very instability, the fragility, the interdependence that defines our planetary moment. So don't look for a plot, look for a pulse. Don't listen to answers, listen to resonance. Let the opera happen to you. Thank you. So we will now, we have quite went through our time, but we'll just do a short break before we are going to prepare. We need just 5 minutes, but let's make it 7.5, but not much longer. And so we prepare to listen to the piece by Aske Zidore, and then we'll see how much time will remain to us to have a short discussion between all of us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I know.